This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by global energy law firm Bracewell, LLP. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast series on liquefied natural gas, or LNG, we're going to talk to research group Resources for the Future's economist, Brian Prest, who's a fellow and director for the Social Cost of Carbon Initiative with Resources for the Future. Brian's going to talk about the findings in two major and conflicting reports by the Department of Energy and S&P Global on LNG demand and its impact on the U.S. economy and national security. Brian's been with Resources for the Future since earning his PhD from Duke University in 2018. Before that, he worked as a senior analyst with NERA Economic Consulting, as an analyst with the Congressional Budget Office, and as an intern with the Brookings Institution Hamilton Project. His work's been featured in multiple peer-reviewed economic and environmental journals and in major media outlets. So, Brian, let's start with the basics. What is liquefied natural gas, or LNG? We all know the seriousness of natural gas's carbon emissions, and especially of its more climate-inflaming methane emissions. But give us an overview of the economic importance of natural gas in the U.S. and global fuel mix, and especially liquefied natural gas.
Hi, Herman, thanks for having me. I'm happy to talk about this. So liquefied natural gas, or LNG, we'll be using that acronym a lot, I'm sure, today. It's a super cooled version of natural gas. It's cooled down to negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit, and that makes it denser and more compact in its liquid form. It's 600 times smaller than regular gas that may come out of your stove. And that makes it easier to store and to transport around the world on ships instead of via pipeline that gas typically is. What this allows is it allows countries without access to domestic or piped gas resources like Japan, Korea, parts of Europe, and so on to import it and use it in their energy systems. It's commonly used in the power sector, but also for other purposes like heating and cooling and so on. Although its role in the fuel mix of any particular country varies from place to place. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Keep going. Sounds good.
Okay. Yeah. This played a big role recently with Russia invading Ukraine. Russia turned off the gas to Europe, and Europeans scrambled to reduce their gas demand and also secure alternative sources of supply. And so U.S. exports of LNG stepped in. And U.S. exports of LNG has really been rising dramatically over the past decade or so. And that's been controversial. There's concern about the impacts on domestic prices if we start sending U.S. gas overseas. There's also controversy over the carbon intensity, as you mentioned. You mentioned the climate impacts, particularly from methane emissions. So some people argue that exporting natural gas could help reduce global emissions by offering a substitute for, say, coal generation and overseas. But other people worry about the methane emissions associated with the gas production up and down the supply chain. There was even a controversial study last year that suggested that LNG could be more carbon emitting than the coal power it could be replacing, which would be a big deal, although I don't think that's quite where the consensus is at. But one lesson from that debate is that the carbon footprint of LNG exports matters, and it's heavily dependent on the methane emissions up and down the supply chain, which can vary a lot based on where the gas is sourced.
Yeah, carbon emissions matter. And then, of course, there's this other dimension that you just described, the crucial value of it in Europe to get off of the Russian supply now that we have this conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And we're going to get to all these things sooner or later, but let's just start with introducing these two conflicting reports about the impacts of LNG exports. One, you've done a lot of work comparing them, and one is from the Department of Energy, one is from S&P Global, Dan Yergin. Let's start with the question of the price. What do they project about the impact of LNG exports on natural gas prices, assuming that there's an increase in LNG exports, which leads to an increased demand for natural gas, It's going to have an impact on natural gas prices of some kind, perhaps. And how is that going to affect right here in the US consumers' electricity and heating costs? And you've done the comparison. How do these two reports differ on that subject?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me take a step back and just put these two reports in context. Both of them were very much prompted by the Biden administration's pause in LNG export approvals for new permits for new facilities to export LNG from the U.S. That happened about.
That was the Biden administration's
That's
pause,
right. That was a little bit a bit more than a year ago, and basically they paused the permits of the approval of new permits for LNG export facilities in the U.S. Pending a review of its impacts on prices and on methane emissions. So the things that we've been talking about. And so the study, the DOE one, came out in December, and that was the culmination of the pause in that review. And then the S&P one was industry one that was essentially offering their take. And you're right; they offered very different predictions for the impacts on natural gas prices. The DOE report was projecting something like a 30% increase in the price of wholesale natural gas at Henry Hub, whereas the S&P report was predicting something much smaller, like more like 4% increase. But
it's a huge difference.
Huge difference, yeah. But a major reason for the difference was not, a dispute or disagreement about how markets function. It was a disagreement about how much natural gas we actually expect the pause in permitting, should it be lifted, which it has been, how much that would actually affect increased demand for U.S. gas supplies. And the DOE report was projecting a pretty big impact, something like 30 billion cubic feet per day of increased pull on domestic gas sources, whereas the number for S&P was more like 5 billion cubic feet per day. And so, on its kind of percent increase in price per billion cubic feet of exports, they were actually not that different. It was just very different perspectives on the scale or the scope of potential increased U.S. LNG exports.
Interesting. So the difference in projected exports in the reports would affect the amount of price increase. If there's a lot of exports, that raises the price. Explain this to me a little bit in economic terms. If there's more exports, that raises demand for U.S. natural gas for electricity and heating, and it raises the price. If there's less exports, then there's not such a pressure on increased prices, and electricity and heating might be a little bit more affordable in the U.S. Have I got that right?
Yeah, the logic is right. That's kind of the basic economics. You could think of exports, LNG exports, as being an additional source of demand for U.S. gas supplies. And so if you increase demand in, in our Econ 101 classes, increased demand means higher prices, and more increased demand means more higher prices. So, the amount that we expect a policy change to actually affect LNG demand and hence prices is going to depend on the magnitude of that.
So that goes back to the permitting of facilities to transform natural gas to LNG and then send it out of the country. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And so if we look back, before DOE paused the permits of new LNG facilities in the U.S., there had already been approved 44 billion cubic feet per day worth of export capacity before the pause. And the DOE report said that in kind of their business as usual case, without any pause, that's a pretty large number. They projected that the demand would exceed that basically by 2040, 2045, something like that. And so a lifting of the pause would be meaningful. S&P's projections are more modest, suggesting that the pause might, that 44 billion cubic feet a day of export capacity might be plenty, and so lifting it would actually have less of impact on LNG export demand and hence less of an impact on prices.
This episode is brought to you by the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, where law, policy, and strategic communications intersect to help clients navigate what's next. At Bracewell, we know energy. It's the industry we serve, the power behind big ideas, and the force we bring to every challenge. For nearly 80 years, our firm has helped industry leaders tackle high-stakes challenges with creativity, precision, and results. Bracewell's DC-based policy resolution group helps clients anticipate what's coming so they can shape what's possible, from chaos to clarity. Learn more at bracewell.com/PRG.
Now, is there an underlying uncertainty that you can pinpoint to why these projections were different?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of reasons. It's often hard to dig into the weeds of the models about what's underlying that, but so there's the question of projections of global gas demand in general before you even get to this, the share of that global gas demand that is in the form of demand for LNG imports, separate from, say, piped gas. And so there were differences in the global gas demand projections, with DOE being higher and the S&P being lower. And then the same was true for LNG demand specifically. Something like 120 billion cubic feet per day of LNG, global LNG demand was what DOE projected for 2040, but less than 90 for S&P. So something like approximately 2/3 as much. And then of that, you go into just the share of global LNG demand that's met by U.S. supply. There was again a substantial gap between DOE and S&P, with DOE being on the higher end in the ballpark of 40 billion cubic feet per day by 2040 and continuing to rise, whereas S&P was closer to 25 and flatlining.
This might be a little bit beyond the scope of your paper, but I'm just curious if you have any insights. One of the things that we think of most when we think of LNG exports is supporting our compatriots in Ukraine, and by assisting Europe, all of Western Europe and Central Europe, from getting away from dependence on Russian natural gas supplies. Is that, how do you balance that with the need to restrict the use of natural gas to prevent the methane emissions?
So I would say that if you're worried about the carbon footprint of natural gas, you should be focused first and foremost on the methane emissions up and down the supply chain. And so if you look at, say, the US, half of US gas supply comes from basically two regions. One is Appalachia, so Marcellus, Pennsylvania area, that has very low methane intensities, low leak rates of, say, less than 1%. And then the other biggest source is the Permian Basin, which is an oil-directed play where the associated gas production is co-produced with the oil, and there's less of an economic incentive to capture the methane there to deliver it to market in the form of gas, and so the leak rates are much higher, up to an order of magnitude higher. And those things, that difference is enormous and can have huge impacts on the carbon intensity of the gas. So the paper that you alluded to that I wrote recently was trying to get a handle on that. So if we're starting to export more LNG, if that puts upward pressure on gas prices in the US, where does the drilling increase? Where does the title of the paper is, where is the marginal methane molecule come from? And the upshot of the paper was, well, first, we expect that most of the gas to come from relatively dry gas plays, such as Appalachia, where leak rates are low, which is actually a good thing. It suggests that the marginal source of gas supply is less methane intensive than the average, and that's important to account for. But then the second question was, well, what would be the impact on prices necessary for gas supply to ramp up to fill that gap from the additional LNG demand? And we talked earlier about the estimates from DOE and S&P. Both of those suggested that each billion cubic feet per day of increased exports was on the order of a 1% increase in wholesale gas prices. My estimates are much larger, something like 2.5%, so about 2.5 times larger than those numbers.
I did a story right when the war between Ukraine and Russia started. And one of my sources said we need to find a way to supply the LNG that our allies in Europe need so that they can decrease their dependence on Russian natural gas. But we also need to find a way to do it without creating long-term permanent infrastructure that perpetuates U.S. dependence on natural gas. Have you come across in your research any hints of how that can be done?
I think it's a tough circle to square to circle. I mean, if we do build out the LNG export terminals, they're going to be available for decades to come. And so you do have a very real concern about lock-in of long-lived infrastructure. I think the difficulty with understanding the long-term climate impact of this is just understanding the substitution patterns. So if our LNG went to India and crowded out the use of coal, then that could be a net win for emissions, at least in the near term. But in the long term, it's probably going to be competing with zero carbon sources. The same is probably true in Europe, but there's you don't have the coal margin. You have it's very likely that increased LNG exports to Europe are competing with something that's lower carbon, and it's going to lead to increased emissions. And so it's very uncertain what the global long-term emissions consequences of LNG exports would be.
Interesting. Okay, one last question before we go. I had a question in mind about asking you about alternatives, but you just really just described it in the most interesting way. So I want to ask you one other question. The DOE paper was December. I think the Jurgen paper, S&P Global, was January. We've had a few months. We're now most of the way through April. Have we seen any market response that leans toward the accuracy for either DOE or S&P Globe?
That's a great question. And I think, honestly, it's too soon to tell. But loosely speaking, DOE's report saw much more of a margin for LNG to be offsetting zero carbon energy, as well as other things, whereas S&P saw much more of a margin for LNG to be offsetting other sources of gas or other fossil fuels like coal. And so there was certainly disagreement there, but to what extent that comes true is going to depend on long run impacts on the construction of, say, coal-fired power plants or the shutdown of coal-fired power plants, as well as long-run investments in deployment of zero carbon energy. And so I don't think that's anything you can really take a firm stance on over, based on 3 months of data.
Yeah, exactly, and especially in the uncertain political context. Okay, I want to thank you. My guest has been Resources for the Future Fellow and Director of its Social Cost of Carbon Initiative, Brian Prest. He's given us a wonderful briefing on 2 major and conflicting reports by the DOE and S&P Global on the impacts on the U.S. economy and national security of LNG exports. I also want to thank our sponsor, Bracewell LLP. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.